Anybody taking anatomy class? Yeah. Has Miss Monk not talked about the striatum yet? No? Okay. So we cross over a couple things. That may be one thing that we look at, and then there's another one with nature, nurture, and genetics and twins is something that we look at a little bit as well. Sometimes twins is an important study, important aspect of the nature, nurture debate. Because what you can do is, they're carbon copies with their genes, and then you put them into separate environments. That's the ideal unethical social experiment. Take two twins, separate them from birth, right? And then follow them over the course of their life. Any type of similarity that they have, psychologists, scientists attribute that to their genetics, right? Their nature side. Any type of difference that they acquire, then the assumption is that that's the result of their social influences and the social environments and the nurture side there. So that's like the ideal, perfect experiment. However, you can't ethically do that. Anytime you find twins, hey, let's split them up, see what happens, right? Not going to necessarily be the most ethical thing to do. But that's one of the concepts that we're going to look at a little bit later today. But first, let's talk about hormones and the endocrine system. Exactly what you wanted to talk about today, looking forward to today. So the endocrine system, genes and behavioral genetics is our topic today. Since we got so many notes today, we'll go ahead. Again, I'm usually split this up into two different lessons, but we'll just do it with one day today. So we're going to try to squeeze everything in the time that we have. I think we'll be fine, though. Our objective is to identify the functions associated with various glands of the endocrine system, system of ductless glands that we have throughout our body. And they produce hormones. So the first thing that we need to consider today, what do you think of when you hear the word hormones? Why don't you take a moment and go ahead and share that if you feel comfortable with the person in front of you. Maybe write something down first, what comes to mind when you think of hormones, and then share that with the person near to you. Give you a second to do that. All right, so what comes to mind? Not much conversation going on. Logan, what do you think? Testosterone. Okay, so that comes to mind as a specific hormone. What is testosterone? What do you think of behavior-wise associated with testosterone? More what? Risky? Okay, more risky behavior. Very good. All right. Anybody else say testosterone? Think of testosterone. What do you think of, Seth? Big and manly. So you think muscles? You think of muscles, right? I heard this from a unique source. It was actually my person that cut my hair when I was growing up, and she told me that you can tell the level of one's testosterone in males based off of how much hair they have on their head later on in life. If you get an excessive amount of testosterone, you know what happens to your hair? It falls out. Right? You become bald. So bald guys usually happen to have a higher level of testosterone than than guys that still have their hair. So that's one thing to consider there. But I think about muscles. I think about performance-enhancing drugs, right, associated with testosterone there as well. I think about aggressiveness. I think about roid rage. You think about those terms. Before we go on with hormones, I do want you to remember the first thing that we said at the beginning of this chapter was thinking about everything that we do, whether it would be a cognition or an outward behavior, has its predisposition and a biological foundation, right? So this is something that reiterates that idea again. So other than testosterone, what else did we say? Cal?
I said, like, the differences between boys and girls.
Yes, so you got testosterone with males, a lot of times, or a higher influx of testosterone there, and then the influx of, what's the other one? More popular hormone for femininity in females. Anybody know what that is? Estrogen levels, right? So I think there's a misconception sometimes that gets students in the classroom and think that males only produce testosterone and that females only produce estrogen. Both produce estrogen and testosterone. We just have varying levels of it. Males more likely to have higher levels of testosterone. Females more likely to have higher levels of estrogen. Are there any other events in one's life that you think about with hormones? Yeah.
Puberty.
You think about puberty. There's always an influx of hormones there, so you get this emotional roller coaster that goes on in one's life there. Anything else? Other times? I know that that's more immediate to you. I think of pregnancy, right? A woman that's going through pregnancy, there's just the amount of hormones that her body is producing because of that transition that she's going through is just elevated. And the emotion, when my wife was pregnant, I didn't have to say anything to her. You just look at her the wrong way, and then all of a sudden you have this emotional outburst, right? And that's all because of the hormones that her body's producing. So I'll give you a couple images to think about. When I think of hormones, I thought about testosterone, performance-enhancing drugs, manliness. Yeah, right there. Notice he's bald there as well. So I thought about pregnancy, relating to my wife, and then I think about emotions, right? A lot of the emotions that we have are really reflective of our hormones that our body is producing, whether it would be extreme sadness and all of these images there. Okay, so where do these come from? Where do the hormones come from? They come from our endocrine system, a system of ductless glands throughout the body that produce hormones. So for the most part, we've been focusing recently on parts of the brain, right, and their functions. Maybe even neurotransmitters that are found throughout our nervous system. But what we haven't focused on so much is this system of ductless glands throughout the rest of our body and its influence on our behavior. So that's what we're going to do here for a few moments at the beginning of class today. System of ductless glands. Okay. Here's a list of them. You got the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, which includes a strong relationship with the pancreas and adrenal glands, and then the gonads there as well. As we go through them, I just want to highlight their functions just like we did with the different parts of the brain, and give you a heads up on certain characteristic quality descriptions associated with each one of them that may show up on your assessment on Wednesday. Okay, we'll start with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland. So you may write that out to the side of the pituitary gland. It is found up in your head, right next to the hypothalamus. Okay, remember we said the hypothalamus was only about 2 ounces, but extremely small but extremely powerful, right? So right next to it is the pituitary gland, which controls all of the other glands in the endocrine system. Okay. You guys ever seen Men in Black? I know they recently came out with one, right?
Yeah.
Will Smith one was in that one too?
No.
Not in this one? Okay. All right. Decided to step away from it. Well, he was in the first one, and maybe the second and third one. I don't know how many there have been. But in the first one, in like the first scene, we hadn't been exposed to any aliens yet, and Will Smith goes into a restroom, and there's this guy standing in front of the mirror in the restroom, and you look at him, and he's looking pretty normal, and then all of a sudden, like this skull opens up, right, and then inside of his skull, there's like this control panel with this teeny tiny alien sitting behind this control panel operating the human being, right? So it reminds me, every time I think of the pituitary gland, I think of that specific scene, as if the pituitary gland is like the master gland sitting behind this control panel operating the rest of our endocrine system. Sound good? What does it do? The main function is it secretes the hormones associated with growth and reproduction. Okay, so growth and reproduction. I want to focus mainly on growth. Okay, if you get too much of this growth hormone that's secreted from the pituitary gland, what happens? You get too much. I guess this is the wrong one. Too much would lead to this. It would be giantism. You guys ever heard of giantism before? Right? The story of David and Goliath. For a lot of scientists and researchers that study genetics, the assumption is that Goliath had too much of this growth hormone secreted from his pituitary gland, which made him into this giant of a figure there. Right? I think there was a guy, I just saw his former principal. He was traveling through southern Illinois. There's a town down there in southern Illinois that has the tallest guy in like human history. He's like 8, 9 foot tall. It's like crazy how tall he is. Anybody heard of this guy?
Yeah.
He's like 8 foot.
He's like 8'3".
8'3", yeah. And you suffer from giantism, from having too much of this hormone secreted by your pituitary gland. Initially you think about these individuals, man, that would be awesome to be that, big. I could just dunk a basketball by just standing right there, right? But there's deficiencies in other areas. For example, like their eyesight, their ability to sense depth. Just isn't able to process things just like we are, like a healthy individual would be. So it's not always a good thing. Okay. So you get the opposite. What would be the opposite then? Dwarfism. Okay. So too little of this hormone that's secreted from a pituitary gland would lead to dwarfism then. So those are the two terms, the exceptions, giantism and dwarfism. I know there's quite a few others names, terminology that's thrown out there for short people. I've heard quite a few of them myself, but the correct terminology is dwarfism then. Okay. All right, the next part of the endocrine system that I want you to be familiar with is the thyroid glands. The thyroid glands are found in your throat, and the main function and purpose of the thyroid is to help us with the process of metabolism. So you remember, right, metabolism out to the side of thyroid. As a young student in elementary and grade school, I hear people that would have thyroid cancer, right? And I would think, man, they're going to have to do some surgery on their legs. It's completely off with the location of where the thyroid was. Had no idea what its function was either. Okay, so it helps with metabolism. What is metabolism? May I explain metabolism?
Like digesting food.
Yeah, so in your food, you've got the calories, right, the built up energy. And so your thyroid is going to be able to get that energy from the food that you're consuming, okay? So you've heard of people that have had thyroid cancer, correct? And a lot of them, what happens is they have a procedure that removes their thyroid, right? So if they don't have a thyroid, how are they able to still metabolize the food that they're ingesting? Anybody think about that before? I imagine it's the consumption of a lot of pharmaceutical, a lot of medicine that they're going to be ingesting to try to compensate for that, for the lack of the functioning thyroid there. Okay, so think of metabolism with your thyroid. All right, the next one is your pancreas, and with your pancreas, we're thinking about, I believe. I always have to look at this one. Insulin and glucagon. insulin and glucagon. With the production of insulin and glucagon, what we're talking about is blood sugar levels and the regulation of your blood sugar levels. Too little insulin produced leads to diabetes, and your blood sugar levels go up too high. Okay, you can have the opposite, where your blood sugar levels go down too low as well, and that can be very dangerous at the same time. Okay, so a healthy functioning pancreas is going to be able to help you to regulate your blood sugar levels in a healthy manner there. I have a brother-in-law, my age, and he's struggling. His pancreas doesn't function at a high level, and so he's got to constantly be monitoring his blood sugar levels. He's got to limit. I don't know how he does it, but he's got to limit all the sugars that he intakes, and he's got to get rid of a lot of the different types of foods that I don't know if I could live without. But he's really disciplined with what he does there. The adrenal gland is the next gland. With the adrenal gland, I want you to think of adrenaline and adrenal gland. Sound good? Adrenaline is associated with our activation of one of our nervous system, or sympathetic nervous system, right? So the fight or flight. So I want you to think about adrenaline getting us up, getting us going. Make the connection to our sympathetic nervous system. Remind you of last week when we had, was it Officer out of this hour? Mr. Herman, right? So he came in. Your body's adrenal gland's gonna, kickstart itself, and here it comes the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So this, you'll see. Imagine the adrenal gland being activated here. I actually had a situation this morning. You remember your sub on Friday? Mrs. Ray, right? So she was out walking this morning, and I had gone for a run this morning, and it was still pretty dark. It doesn't get light until around 7 now. And we were down in the Lower Lake Park, and there's a spot where you can walk back in there. And it was already just a little bit light, but it wasn't a lot of light. You're still in the woods back there, so it's still a little bit dark. And so I was probably about 10, 15 feet, and she was walking with another woman. And I said, I'm going to pass you on your left. And you can see her arms. Her arms go like this, and they go like this. As if I scared her. Her heart started to beat a little bit faster. The adrenal glands were going there. All right, and the last one is the gonads. The gonads with the endocrine system. With this one, it's going to produce a lot of the hormones, testosterone for males and estrogen for females, that are associated with secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics associated with your gonads. That's the one that I want to emphasize. Adrenal glands sometimes produces certain types of hormones that are going to play a role in sex characteristics as well, but I want you to associate them with the gonads there. So you could see that facial hair, that would be considered a secondary sex characteristic. A lot of the changes that you see physically with going through puberty, from middle school up here to high school, all of that is a result of your gonads. Okay, so the difference between males and females, the gonads for the males would be the testes, and then the gonads for the females would be the ovaries. So you may want to differentiate that. Testes for the males, ovaries for the females. Now we mentioned the Shri earlier. Actually, we'll get to the Shri in just a moment. Don't want to jump ahead of myself. All right, transitioning from the endocrine system to talking about genes and behavioral genetics. You ever heard of the Human Genome Project before? Right? So their goal is to map the human genome, the DNA, and try to figure out each and every gene and think about its consequences there. And the idea is that if you could map everything, then you could predict and anticipate any type of abnormalities, and then help eventually correct those that way. So I always start off with a question. They started this Human Genome Project many years ago. Have they completed it? Yes or no? You want to take a guess? Yeah, they have. How do you know?
I read somewhere that they have.
Okay. One easy way to remember that they have is there's this organization out here today that it's called CRISPR. We're going to write that acronym down. CRISP, it's all capitalized, and then the R is lowercase, CRISPR. They have developed this ability to go in and look at your DNA, and if there's a certain segment of your DNA that could potentially lead to, say, some type of cancer or disease later on down the road, they theoretically, and I believe physically, they can go and snip that section of DNA, get rid of it, and then what happens is when you procreate, then you don't pass that gene mutation down to the next generation, right? So they've already done some stuff, I believe, with animals that way, with CRISPR stuff, and it's becoming in the air. It's crossing over some gray area of ethics, like ethical guidelines. So some people have started talking about, like, for parents, like developing a menu system of what type of characteristic you want to have in your child, picking and choosing that way. So it does become a little bit controversial, but if you really think about it, being used in a healthy manner of eliminating all these gene mutations and trying to get rid of these cancers that pass down from generation to generation, pretty cool stuff there. Okay, so yes, they have completed the Human Genome Project. So let's think about it for a second. What are genes? Genes are simply segments that are found. Segments of DNA that are found on our chromosomes. Okay? 22 of those 23 pairs of chromosomes are called autosomes, and these are the ones that determine our outward characteristics and qualities. Well, it could be inward, I guess. Intelligence could be a part of that, but you think about your, Preston asked me why his hair was curly the other day. He says it's genes. Every time I say jeans to him, he thinks pants, jeans. But these are things that height, weight, eye color, all of that's on your autosomes. Okay, the 23rd pair of chromosomes called the sex chromosome, and so this is where we get our male or female. So you have XX for male, and then XX for female, and XY for male. Okay. Next thing I want you to consider, and there's a good test question here, and I always forget to share it, so I put a specific slide in here, about differentiating genotype from phenotype. Genotype is we may carry a gene for a particular, say, disorder, right? But a lot of times it's not activated, it's not turned on, and so we don't exhibit it in an outward behavior, so that means it's not in our phenotype. So genetics, our genotype, we have the gene, but it may be a recessive trait, so we don't exemplify it, right? The phenotype is the outward appearance here. So I imagine you guys have heard about that in your science classes, right? Just like homozygous and heterozygous and the Punnett square, those type of things, right? So there are certain rules for gene pairs whenever it comes to passing them down. It's not just dominant recessive. Dominant recessive is a common one, but there's more than just dominant recessive rules for gene pairs. Okay, so starting off with the dominant recessive, I want to give you characteristics. I want to give you psychological disorders that follow these rules of gene pairs. At least the first couple here. With dominant recessive pattern. Give you two of them. Huntington's chorea, or commonly known as Huntington's, that follows this dominant recessive pattern. So that would be, it followed the dominant gene, right? So if you have a parent that has Huntington's, right, they have a big T say they have a big T, little t, and then the other parent would be little t, what's the chance of you having Huntington's? If you really think about it that way. You might visualize it.
Could you repeat it?
If you have a parent that has Huntington's, and that's exemplified by big T, little t, and then you have a parent that doesn't have Huntington's, so we're assuming that it's little t on the other side, what's the chance of you having Huntington's?
2 out of 4.
2 out of 4. It's 50%. Yeah, you have a 50% chance, okay? And so, for a lot of us, 50%, that's a high percentage chance, right, of you having Huntington's. And so it's kind of an unnerving situation. What is Huntington's? It's a disease that it takes your nervous system and it just breaks it down, right? And what you usually see is its onset is around the early 20s or between the ages like 20 and 30 is whenever you have this disease. So it really does decrease your life expectancy quite significantly. You don't really know that you have it until it just all of a sudden one day turns itself on, okay, unless you do this gene identification thing that they have today, okay. I'll give you another one, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia also follows this dominant recessive gene pattern. However, it follows the recessive gene. So you could have 2 parents that aren't schizophrenic, but they carry the gene for schizophrenia, and then you would have what percentage of a chance?
1 out of 4.
It would be 1 out of 4, 25%, right, chance of having schizophrenia. If you have 2 parents that have schizophrenia, what's the chances of you having schizophrenia?
100%.
100%, right? So that's the worst of worst scenarios there, okay? So keeping that in the back of your mind. All right. Polygenetic inheritance, okay? What this is it says that many genes influence a single characteristic. When they were doing the Human Genome Project, I thought it was fairly simple, where you just flip one gene on and, you get that quality, that characteristic. But what they found was it's a plethora of genes working together for certain characteristics, certain situations. So that makes it quite a bit more complex than they originally anticipated, okay? Skin color would be a good example of this. Skin color. When you have somebody that happens to have a darker skin color procreate with somebody with a lighter skin color, it's usually not one or the other. It's usually someplace in between, right? For example, Preston and I just started a book about Derek Jeter last time. Derek Jeter has a dad who's has a darker skin color, and his mom has a lighter skin color. And so Preston asks, is he a dark-skinned guy, or is he a light-skinned guy? And I'm like, well, he's not really either. He's somewhere in the middle. He's in between, right? So skin color doesn't necessarily follow the dominant recessive pattern, right? That way, okay? Other polygenic characteristics are subject to environmental influences as well. Sometimes height could be an example of that, where some children, they have the potential to be of a particular height, but because of environmental influences, they just never get there. They don't reach that potential, okay? Last thing on this rules for gene pairs is sex-linked inheritance. And this goes along with the way we write out our chromosome, or XX for females and XY for males, okay? So I want to show you something. I got to get away from this so I can draw something on the board. All right, so we said that females are XX, right? And then males are XY, right? So for the longest time, when I was learning about this in grade school, I just thought that they were like variables, XX and XY, like what we have in math class. You know what I mean? But when they use the word XX and XY, it's really not talking about variables. They're talking about what do the genes look like, or what do the chromosomes look like, okay? So these are pairs of chromosomes So when a female has a deficiency on, say, this leg of the X chromosome, sometimes they will have another gene on this side of the other X chromosome to wipe that deficiency out, right, to compensate for it. And so what happens? They carry the deficiency, but they don't necessarily exhibit the deficiency. Sound good? Males, if they have a deficiency on this leg of the X chromosome, is there anything over here to compensate for that deficiency? There isn't, okay? So you gotta think of a Y being drawn up like this, where it's really a legless X, is what it is, okay? So a good example of this would be color blindness. All right, color blindness down. So a lot of color blindness, the characteristics are found on this particular section of the X chromosome, and then for males, they just don't have anything to compensate for it. So it doesn't mean that females can't have color blindness. It just means that you have quite a few more males that have color blindness than females. Do we have any colorblind males in here? No? Okay. Do we have any colorblind females? I've had that situation happen before. Right. Say something and then we get the complete opposite in class. No? Alright. Let's finish up. Mentioned this before. Behavioral genetics, what they're trying to figure out is the effects of nature or nurture on the outcome of our life. Which one's more influential? This debate's been going on for quite a few years. You can really narrow it down to specific areas like intelligence, personality characteristics. What do behavioral geneticists study? Ideally, they're going to study twins, exemplified there with the image. And what they'd like to do is they'd like to see situations in which they are growing up in two different environments. And again, the differences can be identified as social or nurture side. And then the similarities that they have with one another would be identified as the nature side. Okay, has there been I know sometimes it's difficult to differentiate nature and nurture. Nature is genes, and then nurture is social influences or aspects of the environment. Nature is genes, nurture is social. Okay. It does ask the question, what two areas are influenced by both heredity and environment? And I believe, yep, it's personality and intelligence. Personality and intelligence there. A little bit of both. All right, we are about out of time.